Brian Balogh, Gary Gallagher, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Doug.
Now, I just want to say that it's easy to make fun of Gary about Twitter, but I want all of you to see the way he handles a piece of chalk in the classroom. He is a master. He can draw railroad tracks leading to battles faster than anybody I've ever seen.
Condescension comes naturally to tall people. I know that many of you know that. Sometimes they're not even aware of how condescending they are, but that's just the way it is, and it's.
Oh, we made it.
Thank you so much for talking about this election. It was an important one. My question's a little bit kind of before the first year, just about the media and elections, because I think that's something you didn't really touch on. And I think in this election, one thing people kind of talked about election night was the way the media kind of portrayed the election versus what actually happened. So do you have any insights either on how media previously portrayed elections, or maybe insights on how the media might change future elections based on what happened this time around?
No, I have very harsh opinions about this, so I'm going to let Brian talk about it. I mean, I am not a fan of the election coverage on any part of the spectrum of the election coverage.
Now, this shocks me because, in fact, the media is returning to a mode that Gary knows so well.
It's
and
the
that's
19th century mode,
partisanship.
absolute
So
part,
would
but
you
except
like
they
to-
pretend they're not.
So
That's
I
what
know
I
they
find so
pretend they're not,
obnoxious.
but would you like to talk a little bit
Well-
in case there are people who don't know what that 19th century model was like?
I don't know why Brian was invited to be part of this tonight. I really
To
don't.
torture you, Gary.
No, this is the way the media always were, but they flew their colors honestly in the 19th century, and Thomas Jefferson's mouthpiece didn't pretend to be anything but Thomas Jefferson's mouthpiece. Yeah. And the same thing for the Federalists, and if you were a Democrat during the Civil War, you read the Democratic rags and your heart soared, and if you were a Republican, you read the Republican rags and your heart soared, and they were all filled with fake news. The whole fake news thing is it's mind-bogglingly stupid. That this is something fresh and new. Oh, fake news, we've never dealt with fake news. Really? Are you 3? Have you been awake since you've been growing up? This is something that's been around forever. And go ahead, Brian. You can tell us.
I'm just going to let that go and make another point, which is that the modern media, the post-World War II media, has always struggled when politicians have figured out new ways to get ahead of the news cycle. And the example I would talk about is Joseph McCarthy and the fact that you say, I've got a list here of 120 communists, and the next day it would be 110 communists, and the headlines would say 120 communists, the next day the headlines would say 110 communists, and the media really struggled, Elizabeth, with how you deal with a politician that was in essence gaming the media, and part of McCarthy's power was his knowledge of the news cycle, and there's no question in my mind that Donald Trump is a master at setting the agenda of the news media, and I think the best example of that is, as far as I can tell, an unscientific survey, but I do watch all the cable news network channels just to see what's going on. And probably the channel that covered Donald Trump live more than any channel is MSNBC, the so-called progressive channel. Now that says to me this guy has figured out how to game the media, and I give him a lot of credit for that.
And MSNBC figured out that by doing that, they made more money.
Yes.
There's a direct relationship between that.
That's exactly right.
No,
so I don't know if we've answered your question, but I really do think that we are returning to a partisan press in a 19th century model. And Gary's absolutely right. They're not as honest about it as they should be. There have always been periods where politicians have been first movers. And then everybody follows them and uses that. We're going to have a lot of politicians tweeting from now on.
But Gary, let me ask you this, just to narrow that a little bit. Is it possible that the let's say in the 19th century, in this period, and I also am always amused at this presumption, even when I was in the media, that this idea that somehow whatever your frustration was with media in the present, that this was a proof that it was radically worse than it had been in whatever previous moment. When the reality was that, as you say, I mean, American newspapers were horrible. Even deep into the 1960s, if you go back and read, go back and actually reread the New York Times in 1962, and then reread anything else in the country, and the quality of the Richmond paper. We think that because there were a lot more reporters then, that it was a much better paper, but in reality, incredibly thin stuff, and we don't remember that. But is it the case that did people have a better understanding? Was there a more broadly shared understanding that yeah, that's the Democratic paper and that's the Republican paper, and the ability to make a judgment about that? And then did American society get sort of tricked into thinking that there was that media might be objective? I mean, is that part of why we seem set up for a kind of gullibility about what's happened now? I mean, is there anything to that kind of?
I don't think people in the 19th century believed that if you didn't believe the other side's newspapers were objective. You certainly didn't believe that. You might have believed that yours were, but you certainly didn't believe that theirs were. And I don't know when and if that really changed. I mean, there've always been, I grew up in southern Colorado. The Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post had different points of view. Right. And everybody knew that they had different points of view. I don't know.
Yeah. I would take issue with that, Gary. I'm naive enough to believe that there was a period in the press from roughly the 1920s through the 1960s that at least valued objectivity, that hired professionals who had gone to the Columbia School of Journalism, who learned at least what objectivity meant. And then I think there were structural reasons as television news replaced print news, where people got their news. I think there were structural reasons that the networks were, if not entirely objective, at least tried to be down the middle. And those structural reasons were pretty simple. They had to get 35% of the viewership, otherwise they were out of business. We had 3 networks. If you were lucky. You probably didn't get all 3 out in Colorado.
We only got CBS initially.
There you go. There you go. And that's where your ignorance started, Gary. If you had gotten all 3 channels. No, and so those networks, and there were incredible liabilities connected to that. Right, that's why they didn't cover what was going on in the South, and they didn't cover the atrocities in the South for decades because they needed Southern viewers. So I'm not saying it was all rosy, but they had a real incentive to be down the middle and appeal to all Americans. And so I do think that was different.
Thank you. At the very beginning of this talk, you mentioned that there were expectation levels of leaders that had nothing to do with what was written in the Constitution. And I think a number of people are upset because they don't feel Mr. Trump, in terms of his character and ethics, represent what we'd like to have as a role model in this country, whether that's fair or not. It's been speculated that a lot of his tweeting is very manipulative, that it's a distraction, that people want to hear about Meryl Streep, but it keeps them from focusing on more serious issues. Do you think that that his tweeting is a ploy and mastermind's cleverness to keep people distracted? Or do you think the guy's just a serious narcissist who just has to be out there?
He controls the news cycle with his tweeting. It's amazing. I don't think he does that by accident. I can't believe that somebody has to come up to him and say, Mr. Trump, did you know that your tweets have an effect? I think he knows they have an effect, and I think that he's a master at controlling the message.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a ploy. I would call it a strategy. Does he carefully think out every tweet at 2 in the morning? It's certainly hard to argue that. If I could comment about the importance of norms and behaviors that are just commonly accepted, there's a deep irony here the way society and the way the political system has tended to react to norm breakers, which certainly Mr. Trump is to craft more laws, rules, and regulations, right? If someone doesn't comply with submitting their tax returns, which is a voluntary thing, and it's the norm, it's what presidents have done for 40 years, what do you think is going to happen? There's going to be legislation. There's going to be regulation. Much of the legislation and regulation we have is simply to get people to do what we consider, there's a consensus for, the right thing. And so there's a deep irony here. Mr. Trump has run against rules and regulations, and God knows we probably have too many of them. But the irony is his behavior is likely to produce a plethora of more rules and regulations. At least that's my one and only prediction as an historian, because we're not in the prediction business.
And it's interesting that the discussion about whether his family members can serve in the White House, there's a federal anti-nepotism law, and the current statute was written in response to President Kennedy making his brother the Attorney General. So it's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah. By the way, in terms of patterns, I don't know if anybody saw this, but any of you saw it. If you were watching MSNBC, dreaded is MSNBC, which did double its ratings. And I was on their Sunday morning show all morning on Sunday.
That's what did it.
And that's what did it. 2 days
You put
ago.
him over the top.
I did. I pushed it over the top.
Blackmon bump.
And but one of the only notable thing that I said during that appearance was that in the 5 remaining days before President Trump's inauguration, that by tradition, and certainly to expect, that there would be a big announcement from the president regarding his sort of final commutations and pardons here at the very end. And the guys, and I said that was coming, and in fact, I happen to know that the White House has been giving consideration to a very dramatic, really extraordinary end on this question. And so the guys upstairs just said that something along these lines has just happened, that Chelsea Manning, I guess, has been commuted. There's been talk of that happening, but the real question, though, is whether the president, what he has done, because I know there was active consideration of commuting the sentences of all federal death row inmates. There are about 70 of them, and that would include Dylan Roof and the Boston Marathon bomber, and there was serious consideration being given to wiping them all out. I think they backed away from that. But so I don't. Woody, is there more than Chelsea Manning? That's all so far. So they're going to dribble out, but there'll be much more there. But yeah. So there's a norm that's being held to. This sort of final. I mean, and that's a norm that predates the president, of course. This kind of the sovereign's power. But
you were talking about precedents that are sometimes subsequently enabled into law. The topic I'd like you to speak to is the whole issue of ethics, and the issue of our first president, who has a huge business empire with stakes in a variety of businesses, both domestically and in the United States, that he might be in a position to influence during his role. Your thoughts on, well, I think the precedents one is obvious, but the issue of the view that might give to the country's perception of the integrity of our governance system.
Before you answer, I want a friendly amendment to that question. Did Thomas Jefferson sell Monticello when he became president?
I don't believe he did.
Okay.
I don't believe George Washington. George Washington
George
was one of the
Washington
wealthiest.
sell his land holdings
He was one of
around
the
what became
wealthiest
Washington,
people
D.C.
in the United States.
Yeah.
He was at the very, very top of the moneyed aristocracy of the United States.
It is interesting, to remember that. But I mean, what do you think? I mean, it's still, that wasn't a takeaway from the question, that it is this dilemma of a new norm. It wasn't always the norm, but a new norm of disgorgement and disclosure.
It's just on a level that there's been nothing remotely like. Lyndon Johnson was very wealthy, and his television and radio shows, which he pretended were Mrs. Johnson's,
and which he paid a political price.
He did.
For not revealing.
Yes, he did.
I mean, that would be my answer to you. I think that it would be in Mr. Trump's own self-interest to create more distance between himself as president and his financial holdings, certainly more than simply signing over for the period of the presidency his holdings to his two sons.
His is complicated, and this isn't new with me. I've heard a number of people talk about it. It's complicated by the fact that it's such a brand. I mean, he can't just say, well, let's get rid of this and call it something else.
He can't say he doesn't know.
He can't do it. No, it's
But-
absolutely bound up with his name.
But the reason I say it would be in his interest is, as it stands, there's a prima facie case. I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me that there's a prima facie case the moment he takes office of being in violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. That doesn't mean anything. Impeachment is a political process. The only thing it means something to are those Republicans who are going to be negotiating with Mr. Trump. And they hold quite a cudgel over his head because it's actually the Republicans who are the ones that need to decide to impeach him. And I would not want that hammer hanging over my head if I were Mr. Trump. I would like his several billions of dollars if he's looking for somebody to give it to. I think the Miller Center is a worthy recipient of it.
Absolutely.
The presidents that you mentioned could be argued, Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, FDR, expanded the role of the president versus the legislature. And you mentioned Fillmore and Buchanan, but that's another story. But do you see the imperial presidency becoming a permanent function of our government?
I'd say it is. I mean, I'd say it is a permanent function of our government. It's.
I think that the speed at which decisions need to be made and the potential consequences, specifically lethality, that might occur from deliberation as the founders imagined a deliberative republic, have probably permanently changed the role of the executive. That there simply is not time in the world we live in to deliberate about certain kinds of decisions. And I do think that we talk a lot as historians about continuities, but I think this is one discontinuity. Perhaps Gary would like, since I'm always giving him assignments, would like to talk about the way Lincoln used the telegraph, which was an example of an ability to, I'm assuming, interact with actual battles in a much more timely
in almost
fashion.
real time, which is why Lincoln inhabited the telegraph office so much and would literally be looking over the shoulder of some junior officer who was typing out, deciphering the things as they came in. So yes, time and space shrank dramatically during the Civil War because of the railroad and the telegraph, but but there was nothing looming. The example that Brian gave is the perfect one. You can't go to Congress if you have 20 minutes to decide about whether nuclear weapons have to be, right. I mean, it's completely different. On the other hand, we talk about, I love to hear the back and forth. Obama's used it, all of these, he's used executive power too much. Well, Bush used it even more. There's Abraham Lincoln, that's how he dealt with emancipation. That's the emancipation, he decided, I'll just do it with a proclamation. It's how he dealt with Reconstruction. I don't agree with Congress about Reconstruction. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to put it in a presidential proclamation. I'm going to put emancipation in a proclamation. And now what are you going to do about that, Congress? And so that's a leitmotif through history, at least since the mid-19th century, of presidents using that power in a way that probably the founders hadn't really thought about that much. They wouldn't have said, how are we going to deal with whether or not to get rid of slavery? Maybe the president should just issue a proclamation in the middle of a war. There's a good idea. Let's do that. Everyone would go along with that. But of course they didn't. They lost their minds about it. Democrats did. Speed is important, Brian. I always defer to Brian, especially when he stands up.
The one other thing one might throw into that is that while the contours of the presidency have obviously been changed in ways that would be extraordinarily difficult to radically reverse, but it is the case that we are looking at, regardless of what one's politics are, almost certainly the least popular new president since polling was introduced. And President Trump's approval rating right now, depending on the poll, is in the mid-30s, and has been slipping ever since the election. And it could hit the high 20s very easily. And so if you have and he's been damaged by series of these recent events. That's another thing I tire of, is a kind of this sort of hysterical response that from some folks that is as if he was elected by 99% of the population, and there's this overwhelming support. But in reality, this is a very tenuous presidency before it has even begun. And if that situation were to decline further, I don't think it's any accident that Paul Ryan is the Speaker of the House and a very conventional Republican who could become the most dominant figure in American politics, or that the Vice President is a very conventional kind of figure. It certainly could be the case that if things go badly for President Trump, and I don't suggest that would be a good thing, but if they did go badly for him over the next 6 months, that you could end up with a Republican Congress out of its own self-interest, essentially saying we're not going to work with him. We're going to govern essentially from the Congress as best we can, which is a bit like the late 19th century in some respects, and that would. You could have a very isolated president in the White House under some circumstances.
And I think that is a factor that comes into play in that kind of formulation, is that Trump is not by any formulation a conventional Republican. He's not even a Republican for most of his. I mean, so I think a lot of people actually don't know how to categorize him, and including certainly Paul Ryan and others on the Republican side of the aisles in Congress.
On that front, the comparison, and this could easily be misinterpreted, please don't, but on that particular issue, the comparison that comes to mind is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He could have run as a Democrat, he could have run as a Republican, and when he did run as a Republican, he was anything but a conventional Republican, especially on foreign policy.
We just heard Brian Balogh comparing Donald Trump and Dwight Eisenhower.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug.
That's the tweet, isn't it? Is that what you're going to tweet that, aren't you?
But actually, we're going to run out of time for you guys to enjoy the reception. I mean, if you would, why don't you ask your question directly to these guys in the ante room? But let's say a final thanks to the two of you for doing this. Thank you very much.